My name is Elaine Porter. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside systems that reward composure, compliance, and quiet endurance. I've been a project lead, a senior specialist, the person who keeps things from falling apart without ever being credited for holding the structure together. I'm not the loudest in the room. I'm not the one who commands attention by force of personality. Most people, if they're honest, would describe me as steady, dependable, easy to overlook. That underestimation followed me everywhere. Colleagues assumed my silence meant agreement. Managers assumed my calm meant I could absorb more. When decisions were made that affected my work, my reputation, or my dignity, they often happened without my voice in the room. Not because I wasn't invited, but because no one thought I would object. I had a reputation for being reasonable. What that usually meant was, I wouldn't make things uncomfortable. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing villains or delivering a dramatic payoff. It's about something quieter and far more common. It's about what happens when your integrity is slowly negotiated away in exchange for stability. It's about the moment you realize that my manager forced me to apologize for a problem I didn't cause, and how that moment didn't explode my life, but instead settled into it, like sediment at the bottom of a glass. For a long time, silence was the price of keeping my job. I paid it willingly, even gratefully, because I believed that patience was a form of professionalism, and restraint was a kind of strength. I told myself that fairness would eventually assert itself, that if I kept my head down and my work impeccable, the truth would matter. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of unlearning that belief. There are no shouting matches in this story, no slammed doors, no triumphant speeches. What unfolds instead is a slow psychological reversal, one that happens internally long before anyone else notices. You'll hear how small dismissals compound, how roles get assigned without consent, how being useful can quietly become a cage, and how power, when reclaimed without noise, often goes unnoticed until it's irreversible. I'm telling this from my own perspective, with as much honesty as I can offer. I'm not here to dramatize events or paint myself as flawless. I made compromises. I stayed silent longer than I should have. I participated in my own erasure because it felt safer than resistance. But I also learned something important. Silence can be imposed, or it can be chosen. And those two kinds of silence lead to very different endings. As you listen, you don't need to take sides. You don't need to judge anyone involved, not even me. I only ask that you notice where you've recognized yourself in similar moments, where you've stayed quiet, not because you lacked words, but because you were calculating the cost of speaking. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever wondered who you might become if you stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided not to listen? For a long time, I believed that how people treated me was simply the natural consequence of who I was. Not in a self-pitying way, more like an acceptance of gravity. I was competent, consistent, and calm. I delivered results without theatrics. I solved problems quietly and passed credit upward without thinking twice. In my mind, that was professionalism. To them, it made me something else entirely. At work, I was described with words that sounded like compliments but behaved like limits. Reliable, low maintenance, solid. I was the person assigned to the projects no one wanted to babysit, the one who could be trusted to just handle it. Meetings moved forward faster when I was present because I didn't derail them with ego. I asked clarifying questions, not performative ones. I documented decisions. I followed through. What no one said out loud was that I was also invisible in the ways that mattered. When successes were discussed, they were attributed to the team, or to leadership, or to how smoothly things came together. When problems arose, they seemed to drift toward my desk by default, as if my calm demeanor implied unlimited capacity. I wasn't resentful. I wasn't targeted. I was simply used. Quietly. Efficiently. And because nothing about it felt malicious, I told myself it was fine. I wasn't naive. I knew office politics existed. I just believed that staying neutral kept me safe from them. I thought if I avoided friction, I'd avoid damage. That belief shaped how I showed up every day. Measured, polite, unreactive. I didn't interrupt. I didn't escalate. I didn't challenge people publicly. I waited for the right moment, which somehow never arrived. To my managers, I was dependable infrastructure. Not talent to be developed, but support to be leaned on. I was consulted after decisions were made, not before. I was asked to explain outcomes, not influence direction. When something went wrong, my role was to smooth it over, not to question why it happened. And I accepted that role because it felt earned. Outside observers might have said I was respected. Inside the system, I was tolerated in a very specific way, as long as I absorbed pressure without reflecting it back. My silence was interpreted as agreement. My patience was mistaken for flexibility. My lack of complaint became evidence that nothing was wrong. There were moments, small ones, when I felt the imbalance. A meeting where my suggestion was ignored, then repeated by someone else and praised. An email chain where decisions were referenced that I'd never been part of. A project review where I was thanked for my support instead of my leadership. Each moment was minor enough to dismiss. So I did. I told myself this was just how it worked, that not everyone needed visibility, that impact mattered more than recognition, that I didn't need to be seen to be valuable. What I didn't realize then was that value, when unseen, becomes negotiable. The more consistent I was, the more people assumed consistency was automatic. The more composed I remained, the less anyone checked whether I was okay with the weight being placed on me. My emotional neutrality made others comfortable assigning me uncomfortable things. I rarely pushed back, not because I lacked opinions, but because I believed restraint was maturity. I believed that if something truly crossed a line, I would know. That my internal alarm would sound clearly and unmistakably. Instead, the alarm learned to whisper. By the time I noticed how defined my role had become, it felt fixed. I was the person who would handle it, the person who would adapt, the person who wouldn't make a scene. And once a system decides who you are, it rarely asks for your input again. Looking back, I can see how carefully I trained them. Every time I stayed quiet to keep things moving. Every time I absorbed responsibility without authority. Every time I chose harmony over accuracy. I thought I was preserving stability. What I was really doing was teaching them what I would tolerate. At the time, I would have told you I was content. Not thrilled, not resentful, just steady. But beneath that steadiness was a growing sense of compression. Like standing in a room where the ceiling lowers so gradually you don't notice until you can't straighten your spine anymore. This is who I was to them. Capable, compliant, and conveniently silent. And for a while, that felt safer than being seen. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no obvious injustice. That's why it stayed with me. It arrived quietly, dressed as professionalism, and left just enough confusion behind to make me doubt my own reaction. It happened during a project debrief, a routine one. A client deliverable had gone out late, not by much, but enough to trigger internal scrutiny. I had flagged the risk days earlier. I'd documented the dependency that hadn't been met. I had emails, timestamps, contingency notes. The delay wasn't mine. But when the meeting started, my manager spoke first. He framed the issue in neutral language, the kind that sounds collaborative but subtly assigns weight. He said, "We had some execution gaps," and then looked at me, not accusingly, just long enough for the implication to land. The room followed his gaze. No one interrupted. No one asked questions. I remember thinking, this is strange. He knows what happened. When it was my turn to speak, I clarified calmly. I explained the dependency. I referenced the timeline. I kept my tone factual, careful not to sound defensive. I assumed the truth would realign the narrative. It didn't. My manager nodded, then reframed what I'd said in a way that shifted responsibility back toward me. He talked about owning outcomes, about how leadership meant anticipating obstacles, even ones outside our control. It sounded reasonable. It sounded mature. And just like that, the facts became secondary to optics. After the meeting, he asked me to stay behind. He closed the door, not dramatically, just enough to signal privacy, and told me the client felt uneasy, that they needed reassurance, that someone needed to take responsibility so confidence could be restored. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Then he said the words that changed something in me, though I wouldn't understand how until much later. I need you to apologize. Not for the delay exactly. For the discomfort. For the confusion. For the perception that we hadn't been in control. He framed it as a gesture of leadership. A sacrifice for the greater good. He assured me it wasn't personal. That he knew it wasn't my fault. But optics matter, he said. And you're good at smoothing things over. I remember sitting there, hands folded, nodding slowly as if absorbing wisdom instead of pressure. I remember the brief internal pause, the moment where I could have said no, where I could have pointed out the contradiction, where I could have asked why accountability only flowed in one direction. Instead, I agreed, because it felt small, because I didn't want to seem difficult, because I told myself it was strategic. One apology wouldn't undo my credibility. One concession wouldn't redefine me. That night, I wrote the email. I chose my words carefully. I took responsibility without admitting fault. I apologized for the inconvenience. I promised tighter oversight moving forward. The client replied warmly. The issue dissolved. Everyone moved on, except me. Something about that moment didn't sit right. Not because I'd been wronged in some obvious way, but because I'd been positioned. I had been selected not for error, but for compliance. I was the safest place to put the weight, and what unsettled me most was how easily it had happened. No one challenged the narrative. No one corrected the record. The truth existed, documented and intact, and yet it had been bypassed in favor of emotional management. And I had participated in that bypass. I told myself this was just leadership reality, that accountability was fluid, that sometimes you carry more, so others don't have to. I rationalized it the way competent people often do, by turning discomfort into duty. But a quiet line had been crossed, not by the apology itself, but by the assumption behind it. That my voice could be used to absorb blame without consequence. That my silence could be counted on. That my integrity was flexible, as long as the outcome looked clean. From the outside, nothing had changed. I was still trusted, still relied upon, still seen as steady. But internally, a small cut had been made. It didn't bleed. It didn't hurt much. It just altered the shape of things enough that I began to notice how often I was the one asked to bend. And once you notice that, it's very hard to unsee. After that first apology, nothing immediately worsened. In fact, things seemed smoother. My manager thanked me for handling it well. The client remained satisfied. Internally, the project moved on. On the surface, it looked like confirmation that I'd done the right thing. That's how normalization begins, not with escalation, but with reassurance. The next time something went wrong, it was smaller. A miscommunication between departments, a missed assumption in a planning doc. Again, not mine. Again, traceable. And again, I was looped in late, asked to explain, to smooth, to clarify. No apology this time, just quiet absorption. Then it happened again. Each incident was framed as a one-off, circumstantial. No intent, no blame, just the practical reality of work. And each time I told myself the same story. This isn't personal. This is just how systems operate. What changed wasn't the scale of the disrespect, it was its frequency. I started noticing patterns. When leadership needed someone to own ambiguity, They looked to me. When accountability needed a soft landing, it found its way to my desk. I became the person who could be trusted to carry unresolved tension without making it visible. And because I carried it well, no one saw a reason to stop handing it to me. I learned how to phrase things so they sounded collaborative while conceding ground. I learned which moments to let pass. I learned how to correct errors indirectly, without naming who caused them. My language became smoother, more careful, more neutral. That neutrality I thought was strength. But neutrality, when it consistently costs only one person, becomes erasure. There were meetings where I spoke and wasn't acknowledged at all. Not interrupted, just passed over, as if the sound hadn't registered. A few minutes later, the same idea would reappear, slightly reframed, and suddenly it existed. I would watch it happen and feel a faint internal flicker, then tell myself it didn't matter. The outcome was what counted, except the outcome was slowly becoming my invisibility. When decisions were documented, my name appeared under supporting roles, even when I had led the execution. When successes were shared upward, they were generalized. When failures were dissected, they became specific, and somehow adjacent to me. I began to anticipate this, to preempt it. I softened my emails before sending them. I added qualifiers where none were needed. I removed phrases that might sound too definitive. I was editing myself into acceptability. And still, I stayed. Part of that was practical. I had stability. I had benefits. I had built a reputation that, while quiet, was solid. Walking away felt dramatic. Speaking up felt risky. Staying silent felt manageable. So I adjusted. I told myself I was choosing my battles. That not every slight deserved a response. That professionalism meant endurance. That respect didn't need to be demanded if it was earned through consistency. What I didn't admit was that the disrespect had become subtle enough to be deniable, but consistent enough to be corrosive. No one was cruel. No one raised their voice. No one singled me out publicly. That made it harder to name what was happening. Harder to justify discomfort. Harder to explain why I felt smaller. Even as my responsibilities grew, I started carrying a quiet fatigue, not physical, but moral. The exhaustion of constantly translating myself into something more palatable. The weight of knowing the truth, but choosing the version of it that caused the least friction. Silence became a habit, and habits, once formed, start to feel like character. I told myself this was maturity, that I was above ego, that I didn't need recognition to know my worth. I clung to those beliefs because the alternative, that I was being slowly diminished, felt too unsettling to face. So I normalized it. I laughed off dismissals. I reframed exclusions as oversights. I explained away patterns as coincidence. I convinced myself that this was the cost of being trusted. But trust that only flows one way isn't trust. It's an expectation. And by the time I realized how deeply that expectation had set in, it no longer felt like something being done to me. It felt like something I was participating in. Roles don't always come with titles. Sometimes they're assigned through repetition, through expectation, through what happens when you don't object. By the time I noticed mine clearly, it had already been reinforced dozens of times. I was the stabilizer. That was the unspoken agreement. When things were unclear, I clarified. When timelines slipped, I absorbed the tension. When someone higher up made a decision that created downstream confusion, I translated it into something workable without asking why it had been made that way. I was the buffer between leadership intent and operational reality. People came to me not because I had authority, but because I had capacity. I was looped in after the fact, asked to help clean this up, to align the messaging, to make sure it lands well. These phrases sounded collaborative, even flattering. They implied trust. What they concealed was that I had become the designated absorber of discomfort. I noticed that my workload grew in ways that weren't visible on org charts. Emotional labor, risk management, reputation shielding. I was protecting other people's credibility by quietly spending my own. And I did it well. So well that it became assumed. When something went smoothly, it was because the team was strong. When something went poorly but didn't explode, it was because I had intervened early. That intervention rarely made it into the narrative. It existed in the negative space, the problems that didn't happen. Over time, I realized something unsettling. My value was tied not to what I created, but to what I prevented. I was praised for being unflappable, for being easy to work with, for not taking things personally. These were meant as compliments, but they carried an expectation that I would continue to tolerate ambiguity, misalignment, and occasional disrespect without making it anyone else's problem. I became the person who would take on extra work without being asked, because it needed to be done. The person who would stay late to fix gaps created by decisions I hadn't been part of. The person who would apologize on behalf of the organization, even when the organization wasn't sorry. And slowly, subtly, my role shifted from contributor to container. Containers don't get consulted, they get filled. I could feel it in meetings, in how people spoke around me instead of to me, in how my input was solicited when it was technical, but bypassed when it was strategic. I was trusted with execution, not with influence. At some point, I stopped expecting anything else. That's the part that's hardest to admit. Not that others underestimated me, but that I adjusted my expectations to match their assumptions. I stopped raising ideas that might challenge the direction. I stopped volunteering perspectives that might complicate consensus. I focused on making what already existed work better. It felt responsible, it felt adult. It also felt smaller. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I wasn't angry. I was contained, reduced to function, defined by reliability rather than agency. The role was clear: be useful, be quiet, don't disrupt. And because I performed it consistently, it solidified. No one sat me down and told me this was who I was. No memo announced it. But everyone behaved as if it were understood, including me. The most telling sign was how surprised people seemed when I did push back. Rarely, gently, but enough to register. There would be a pause, a recalibration, as if I had momentarily stepped out of character. Then things would return to normal. That reaction taught me something important. The role I was playing wasn't neutral. It was necessary for the system. My compliance made other people's authority smoother. My silence made decisions appear unanimous. My restraint made conflicts disappear before they had to be addressed. I wasn't just invisible, I was instrumental. And once I understood that, I couldn't unknow it. Because if my silence was holding something together, then my voice, if used differently, could change its shape. At the time, I didn't act on that realization. I wasn't ready. Awareness doesn't immediately become action. Sometimes it just becomes pressure, a quiet pressure, building beneath the role you've been assigned. The day something shifted wasn't the day something went wrong. That's important to understand. Nothing failed. No one embarrassed me. There was no confrontation, no reprimand, no crisis. In fact, if you had asked anyone else what kind of day it was, they would have said it was unremarkable. That's why it stayed with me. It was a Tuesday, ordinary in every sense. I arrived early, as I usually did, with a coffee I didn't really taste, and a to-do list I'd already prioritized in my head. The office was quiet in that muted way it gets before the day asserts itself. Fluorescent lights, low keyboard sounds, the hum of systems waking up. I was reviewing a document I hadn't been asked to review. That too was normal. A decision memo had been circulated. High level, confident, polished. It outlined a new operational approach, one that would significantly affect my team's workload and risk exposure. I recognized the assumptions immediately. I could see where the pressure would land. I could see which dependencies had been overlooked. I could also see my name nowhere in the process. I sat there reading it, not with irritation, but with a kind of detached clarity. This wasn't a mistake. This was consistent. Decisions were being made about my area of responsibility without input from the person responsible for making them work. I knew what would happen next. In a few weeks, issues would surface. Timelines would strain. Someone would ask why this hadn't been anticipated, and I would be brought in, not to question the decision, but to manage its consequences. I closed the document and didn't do anything. That was the shift. Normally, I would have drafted a thoughtful response. I would have flagged concerns diplomatically. I would have offered alternatives. I would have tried to protect the outcome from itself. Instead, I sat back in my chair and noticed how tired I felt. Not physically, but existentially. Tired of correcting trajectories I hadn't set. Tired of absorbing responsibility without authority. Tired of being consulted only when something needed to be stabilized. For the first time, I let myself fully feel that fatigue without immediately rationalizing it away. I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What am I actually protecting here? The company? The team? My reputation? Or a version of myself that had been shaped by accommodation? I realized something then, very quietly. My silence was no longer about professionalism. It was about preservation. And not the healthy kind. Later that day, my manager stopped by my desk. Casual. Friendly. He mentioned the memo, asked if I'd had a chance to look at it yet. I said yes. He waited. I could see the expectation in his posture. Not demanding, just assumed. This was the part where I would offer insight, where I would flag risks, where I would help refine what already existed. I didn't. I've read it, I said evenly. It's clear. That was all. He nodded, satisfied, and moved on. As he walked away, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anxiety, not relief, but awareness. A sense of watching myself from a slight distance. I hadn't pushed back. I hadn't agreed. I had simply not intervened. For years, my default response had been engagement, correction, support. That day, my default was observation. I didn't feel rebellious. I didn't feel strategic yet. I felt honest. The rest of the day passed without incident. Meetings, emails, routine decisions. But beneath all of it was a subtle internal recalibration. A recognition that my participation had been propping up systems that didn't reciprocate consideration. That night, at home, I opened my black notebook, the one I usually used for timelines and follow-ups, and instead of writing tasks, I wrote a single sentence. What happens if I stop compensating? I didn't know the answer. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't making threats, even internally. I was simply allowing the possibility that my constant correction wasn't neutral, that it had consequences, that it might be hiding truths that needed to be seen. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with calm. For the first time, I understood that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean restraint. It could mean choice. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being a weakness. That day didn't change anything on the outside. But inside, something essential had shifted. I stopped assuming it was my responsibility to hold everything together. And that was the moment the balance began to change. Once I noticed the difference between imposed silence and chosen silence, I couldn't go back. The awareness changed how I moved through my days. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but with intention. I didn't announce anything. I didn't withdraw or disengage. I simply stopped filling in the gaps automatically. When ambiguous instructions came through, I followed them as written instead of translating them into something workable. When decisions lacked context, I asked for clarification in writing, rather than inferring intent. When risks were unacknowledged, I documented them without trying to neutralize their impact. From the outside, nothing about my behavior looked confrontational. I was still polite, still responsive, still professional. But the quiet labor I had been performing, the invisible corrections, the anticipatory fixes, began to recede, and people noticed, not immediately, and not consciously. The first signs were subtle. Meetings ran slightly longer. Follow-up questions increased. Small issues surfaced where previously they hadn't. The system began to feel less smooth, less buffered. No one connected this shift to me. That was the irony. My silence had been mistaken for passivity for so long that when it became intentional, it registered as absence rather than action. My manager started checking in more frequently. Not suspiciously, just with a faint edge of curiosity. He'd ask open-ended questions. Everything okay? Any concerns I should know about? I answered honestly, but narrowly. I didn't volunteer solutions. I didn't anticipate needs. I responded to what was asked, no more, no less. It felt strange at first, like speaking a second language, where you have to consciously choose each word. There were moments of discomfort, when I could see an issue forming and knew I could prevent it with a single well-placed suggestion. Those moments tested me. The old instinct flared. Just fix it. It'll be easier. But I stayed still, not out of spite, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped cushioning decisions that hadn't included me. If accountability was truly shared, or if it simply flowed toward the quietest person in the room. What happened was revealing. People began to speak more carefully in meetings. Questions that used to be deferred to me were redirected upward. Assumptions were challenged, not by me, but by the friction created when no one smoothed them over in advance. I wasn't withholding information. Everything I knew was available, documented, and accessible. I was just no longer translating it into reassurance. And because I had built a reputation for competence, my silence carried weight. It didn't read as disengagement. It read as judgment. That wasn't intentional, but it was instructive. I realized then that silence, when paired with credibility, changes its meaning. It stops being invisible. It becomes ambiguous. And ambiguity makes people uneasy. Some colleagues began to over-explain. Others looped in additional stakeholders, just to be safe. Decisions slowed slightly, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to be felt. Still, no one accused me of anything. There was nothing to accuse. I was doing exactly what my role required. What I had stopped doing was more telling than anything I had started. Internally, something steadied. I felt less reactive, less entangled. I wasn't scanning for problems to solve. I was observing patterns, documenting moments, not with the intent to use them, just to understand them clearly. Silence in this form gave me space to see how often my presence had been used as a pressure valve. Space to notice how quickly discomfort rose when that valve closed. Space to recognize that the system had relied on my restraint far more than it had ever acknowledged. Others mistook this shift for fatigue, or maturity, or disengagement. They were wrong. This was the most deliberate I had ever been. I wasn't withdrawing my effort. I was reclaiming my agency. I was allowing the natural consequences of decisions to surface without interference. And in doing so, I began to understand where the real leverage lived. Not in confrontation, not in volume, but in the quiet removal of unpaid labor. Silence had once been the price of keeping my job. Now it was becoming a tool. What they never noticed was how much I had already been preparing long before I ever meant to. Not preparing to leave, not preparing to confront, preparing to understand. For years, I had documented everything out of habit. Timelines, decisions, dependencies, follow-ups. I kept notes not because I was suspicious, but because I was methodical. I liked clarity. I liked being able to trace how an outcome came to be. At some point, those notes became a map. When I stopped compensating, I didn't stop paying attention. In fact, I noticed more. Without the urgency to fix things immediately, patterns sharpened. I could see how often decisions were made in isolation, then quietly redistributed downward as execution challenges. I could see how language shifted depending on the audience, how certainty traveled upward and ambiguity traveled down. I began organizing my notes differently, not emotionally, structurally. I grouped decisions by origin, not by outcome. I linked timelines to names, not roles. I cross-referenced risk acknowledgments with the meetings where they had been dismissed. Everything was factual, dry, boring even. But together, it told a story, not of malice, of convenience. They never noticed because I didn't change my demeanor. I didn't look tense or secretive. I didn't guard my screen or lower my voice. I continued to be exactly who they thought I was: calm, neutral, dependable. That was the advantage. People underestimate quiet people in very specific ways. They assume silence means absence of thought. They assume composure means acceptance. They assume consistency means predictability. They didn't realize that while I had stopped intervening, I had started observing with precision. I noticed how often I was referenced without being present. My role was described differently depending on who was speaking. How accountability softened as it traveled upward and hardened as it moved laterally. I noticed how often my earlier warnings appeared retroactively in conversations, reframed as unknowns, or unforeseeable variables. I noticed which phrases preceded blame and which preceded praise. And I wrote it all down, not as evidence, not yet, as truth. There was something oddly grounding about it. The act of documenting without reacting, of recording without correcting. It gave me emotional distance I hadn't realized I needed. I also began learning, quietly, deliberately, not about office politics, but about structures, risk frameworks, compliance language, escalation thresholds. I read internal policies more carefully than I ever had before. I noted where responsibility officially sat versus where it was culturally assumed. The gap between those two things was larger than anyone admitted. No one questioned why I suddenly asked for written confirmations instead of hallway assurances. No one wondered why I summarized meetings and sent follow-up emails clarifying the scope. They saw it as thoroughness, as diligence. They didn't see it as positioning, because I wasn't positioning myself against anyone. I was positioning myself within reality. What surprised me most was how calm this phase felt. There was no rush, no sense of plotting, just clarity accumulating, layer by layer. Each note, each document, each small observation added weight. Not emotional weight, but structural weight. I wasn't building a case. I was building alignment between what was happening and what was true. And the more aligned things became on paper, the more misaligned they felt in conversation. That contrast mattered, because systems can survive inefficiency. They can survive miscommunication. What they struggle with is contradiction, especially when it's documented, quiet, and unarguable. They never noticed because I never changed the story out loud. I let them keep telling it. I was simply writing down what it left out. By the time I realized how much leverage that created, I didn't feel powerful. I felt clear. And clarity, once achieved, doesn't need to announce itself. The reveal didn't come as a shock. That surprised me. I had expected, if there ever was a moment of realization, for it to feel sharp, dramatic, maybe even vindicating. Instead, it arrived quietly, like something settling into place after a long period of imbalance. It happened late one evening, long after most people had logged off. I was alone at my desk, reviewing a sequence of documents I'd already seen dozens of times before. Decision memos, follow-up emails, risk logs, meeting summaries. Individually, they were unremarkable. Together, they formed a clean, uninterrupted line. For the first time, I laid them out not as records, but as a timeline. And that was when it became unmistakable. There was a consistent pattern in how responsibility was being reassigned after the fact. Decisions made at one level were being reframed as execution failures at another. Risks that had been acknowledged verbally, but never formally, were later described as unforeseen. And in multiple cases, my documented input had been bypassed entirely, then implicitly treated as consent. This wasn't incompetence. It was designed. Not malicious design, not even conscious design, but a system that had learned it could rely on certain people to absorb ambiguity without resistance. A system that functioned smoothly because someone else quietly carried the cost. That someone had been me. What I saw, with sudden clarity, was that I wasn't just a participant in this system. I was a stabilizing factor. My silence hadn't merely protected my position, it had protected theirs. The leverage wasn't in exposing anyone. It wasn't about making accusations or escalating emotionally. The leverage was structural, documented, already in existence. If the truth ever needed to be aligned with accountability, it could be, without interpretation, without argument. And the most important part was this: I didn't need to do anything with that leverage for it to exist. Just knowing it changed how I saw myself. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't powerless. I hadn't been overlooked because I lacked value. I had been overlooked because my value had been consistently converted into silence. The realization brought no satisfaction, no anger, just a strange, steady calm. Because clarity removes desperation, I understood then that I had options. Not impulsive ones, not dramatic ones, but real ones. Options that didn't require confrontation or explanation. Options that relied on alignment rather than force. And with that understanding came restraint. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't hint at it. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I closed the documents, shut down my computer, and went home. The next day, I showed up exactly as I always had. But internally, everything was different. I wasn't waiting till you recognized anymore. I wasn't hoping for fairness to emerge organically. I wasn't bracing myself for the next small cut. I was simply aware. Awareness, I learned, is a form of insulation. It protects you from internalizing what was never yours to carry. It creates distance between what is said and what is true. That distance was where my power lived. Not power over anyone else, power over my own participation. And once you understand that you are choosing your role, not inheriting it, you begin to see the next step not as a reaction, but as a decision. I didn't rush it. I let the clarity sit. Irreversible choices shouldn't be made in haste. They should be made in alignment. The decision point wasn't urgent. No deadline forced my hand. No crisis demanded resolution. That, in some ways, made it harder, because when nothing is exploding, staying feels reasonable. I gave myself time. Weeks, not days. I watched how things unfolded with my new awareness in place. I noticed how often my earlier patterns tried to reassert themselves, how instinctively I reached to intervene, to correct, to smooth. Each time I paused, not to punish anyone, but to ask myself whether stepping in would change the structure or merely preserve it. That question became my filter. I laid out my options carefully, without drama. The first was to stay exactly as I was and accept the role fully, without resentment. To make peace with invisibility and let go of the expectation that fairness would ever recalibrate. That option offered stability, predictability, safety. It also required a quiet surrender I wasn't sure I could sustain without hollowing out. The second option was to confront the pattern directly, to name what I'd observed, to bring documentation forward, to ask for structural change. This was the option people often imagine as standing up for yourself. It was tempting in theory. In practice, it relied on something I no longer trusted: the system's willingness to correct itself when confronted with truth. I had seen too many truths reframed, softened, or deferred. The third option was more subtle. It involved no confrontation at all. It meant aligning my actions strictly with my role as defined, not as expanded by expectation. It meant letting consequences land where decisions originated. It meant removing myself, slowly and cleanly, from being the buffer that kept misalignment invisible. This option wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about escape. It was about consent. Did I consent to continue carrying responsibility without authority? Did I consent to being positioned as the emotional shock absorber? Did I consent to apologizing for problems I didn't cause? The answer, once asked clearly, was simple. No. Choosing that option meant accepting uncertainty. It meant letting go of control over outcomes I had grown used to managing. It meant trusting that clarity, even when uncomfortable, was preferable to quiet distortion. It also meant accepting that some relationships might shift, that my reputation as easy might dissolve, that I might be misunderstood. What surprised me was how calm I felt making that choice. There was no adrenaline, no sense of risk-taking, just alignment. I didn't announce the decision to anyone. I didn't mark the date. I simply stopped consenting internally and let my behavior follow. I began declining responsibilities that weren't formally mine, politely and with rationale. I redirected questions to decision-makers instead of answering them myself. I asked for scope confirmation before proceeding. I documented boundaries the same way I'd once documented risks. Each action was small, reasonable, hard to argue with. Together, they were irreversible, because once you stop absorbing what isn't yours, you can't unlearn that distinction. Once you allow consequences to surface naturally, you can't pretend they're anomalies. I understood then that this choice would change how I was seen, not immediately, but inevitably. The system would either adjust or expose its dependence on my silence. Either outcome was acceptable. That was the moment I knew I was ready to move forward. Not reactively, not emotionally, but deliberately. The decision wasn't to fight. It was to stop compensating. And that decision, quiet as it was, set everything else in motion. Once the decision was made, there was no rush to act. That's the part people often misunderstand. Moving in silence doesn't mean acting secretly or scheming behind closed doors. It means allowing your actions to align so closely with policy, role, and reality that nothing about them can be challenged, only felt. I became precise. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been articulated. If a request came without clarity, I asked for it. If a responsibility wasn't formally assigned, I didn't assume it. I responded promptly, professionally, and in writing. Every action I took could be traced back to something explicit. There was no defiance in this, only alignment. I reviewed my job description carefully, not to weaponize it, but to understand it cleanly. I noted where expectations had drifted over time and where they no longer matched formal accountability. When tasks fell outside that boundary, I acknowledged them without absorbing them. I'm happy to support once ownership is confirmed. Can you clarify decision authority here? Who will be accountable for final approval? These weren't confrontational questions. They were ordinary, reasonable, the kind that should have been asked all along. At the same time, I ensured my own work was beyond reproach. Deadlines met, documentation thorough, communication clear. I gave no one a reason to question my performance, only their assumptions. Financially and legally, I did nothing dramatic. I didn't consult lawyers. I didn't threaten exits. I simply made sure my contributions were visible as contributions, not as quiet corrections. When something succeeded, it was traceable. When something faltered, the decision path was intact. The effect was gradual. Meetings that once relied on me to bridge gaps began to feel heavier. People hesitated before speaking with certainty. Follow-ups multiplied. Decisions slowed, not because I obstructed them, but because the cushion was gone. Still, no one confronted me. That's the thing about silent movement. It doesn't announce itself as opposition. It registers as friction, as discomfort without a clear source. My manager grew more careful in how he framed requests. He asked more questions up front. He looped in more stakeholders. The system was adjusting, trying to compensate for the absence of something it had never acknowledged relying on. I watched without commentary. Emotionally, I felt steadier than I had in years. There was no simmering resentment. No internal debates about whether I should speak up. I had already answered that question, not by talking, but by choosing how I participated. Silence in this phase wasn't withdrawal. It was discipline. I wasn't hiding my intentions. I was simply no longer explaining them. And because nothing I was doing violated policy, etiquette, or professionalism, there was nothing to challenge. Only consequences to manage. That's when I understood something essential. Systems don't react to arguments nearly as much as they react to the removal of unpaid labor. They adjust not when you protest, but when you stop compensating. And the adjustment, once begun, rarely goes unnoticed for long. The consequences didn't arrive with noise. There were no meetings labeled urgent, no emails marked high priority. What changed was subtler than that. Things started slipping. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just enough to be felt. A deliverable missed its internal review window because assumptions hadn't been clarified early. A client's question lingered longer than usual because no one stepped in to reframe it. A cross-team dependency stalled because ownership wasn't as clear as everyone had assumed. Each issue on its own was explainable. Together, they formed a pattern. People began to feel the absence of something they couldn't name. Conversations shifted. I noticed more cautious language in meetings, fewer confident declarations, more phrases like, "we'll need to circle back," or "let's confirm that." The system was feeling its own weight without the quiet support that had once redistributed it. Still, no one blamed me. That was important, because blame requires visibility, and my withdrawal had been almost invisible. I hadn't changed what I did. I'd changed what I absorbed. My manager started checking documentation more closely. He asked follow-up questions that used to be unnecessary. He seemed slightly unsettled, though he never said so outright. The smoothness he had come to rely on was gone, replaced by friction that required attention. Others began to step into the gaps I had vacated. Not comfortably, not efficiently. They asked more questions. They sought alignment where they'd once assumed it. The cost of decisions became more apparent. And still, nothing could be traced back to a single action. That's what made it effective. The consequences weren't punitive. They were natural. I continued to show up exactly as expected. My performance reviews remained strong. My communication remained clear. There was no incident anyone could point to and say, "This is where things went wrong." The system simply stopped being buffered. I watched people experience the discomfort of accountability for the first time. Not in a humiliating way, just in the quiet realization that when no one else absorbs the risk, it belongs somewhere. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative shifted, not toward blame, but toward confusion. People seemed unsure how things had become more complicated. They talked about recent challenges, without acknowledging how long those challenges had been present, quietly managed. I said nothing, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because struggle is information. It reveals where responsibility truly sits. Emotionally, this phase tested my resolve. There were moments when stepping in would have been easy, when I could have restored smoothness with a sentence or two. Those moments tempted me, not out of fear, but out of habit. But I remembered why I had stopped. Because every time I intervened without authority, I reinforced a system that depended on my silence. And I had chosen to end that dependency, not loudly, but decisively. The consequences continued to unfold, not as punishment, but as exposure. Exposure of assumptions. Exposure of misaligned incentives. Exposure of how much had been quietly held together by someone who was never meant to be the foundation. I wasn't satisfied with this. I was simply present. Because when truth begins to surface, it doesn't need commentary. It needs space. And space was something I was no longer afraid to give. By the time anyone tried to fix it, the shape of the problem had already changed. What surfaced first wasn't blame. It was urgency, a tightening in the air. Meetings were called with less notice. Emails that carried a subtle edge of concern, even when the language stayed polite. People were working harder, not smarter, trying to restore a smoothness they hadn't realized was being actively maintained before. The system was reacting, but it didn't yet understand to what. Leadership began to revisit decisions that had already been made. Not to reverse them, but to clarify them. Too late for prevention, only in time for damage control. Questions were asked that should have been asked months earlier. Risk assessments were retroactively constructed. Timelines were re-examined with a new seriousness. I was included in more meetings again, not as an authority, still not that, but as a stabilizer. As someone who could explain what was happening, why it was happening, and how to mitigate the impact. They wanted the old version of me back. I could feel it in how questions were framed. How would you suggest we approach this? What do you think went wrong here? How can we prevent this from going forward? They weren't wrong questions. They were just late, I answered carefully. Factually. I referenced documentation. I pointed to timelines. I clarified the scope. I did not take ownership of decisions I hadn't made. I did not apologize for outcomes that had followed a clear, recorded path. That difference mattered. There was a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when my manager realized something had shifted. It wasn't anger that crossed his face. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you understand that a pattern you relied on has quietly ended. He began speaking differently to me, more cautiously, less assumptively. He stopped finishing my sentences. He stopped expecting immediate solutions. I hadn't become defiant. I had become unmovable. Attempts were made to restore the old dynamics. Soft praise, casual acknowledgments, a few comments about how much my leadership was appreciated. They weren't manipulative. They were reflexive. The system is trying to return to equilibrium. But equilibrium had been built on imbalance, and an imbalance once seen can't be unseen. What made it too late wasn't the accumulation of issues. It was the clarity of documentation. Every attempt to reassign responsibility ran into the same quiet obstacle: the record, emails, memos, follow-ups, decisions traced cleanly to their origin. There was nothing to argue with, no accusation to defend against, no emotion to manage, just alignment between action and consequence. That's when panic began. Not loud panic, but internal. I saw it in hurried calendar invites, in overlapping initiatives, in the way leadership began to hedge language, careful not to commit too firmly to anything. They were feeling the weight they had once redistributed, and they didn't know how to put it back, not without asking me to resume a role I no longer consented to play. I wasn't angry about that. I was resolved, because by the time they realized how much I had been carrying, I had already set it down. And once something has been set down deliberately, it doesn't matter how urgently someone asks you to pick it up again. The moment has passed. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, no accusations thrown across the table. It happened in my manager's office on a Thursday afternoon, with the blinds half open and the hum of normal work continuing just outside the door. He asked me to sit. He started by thanking me for my consistency, for my professionalism, for everything I'd been doing lately. The phrasing was careful, slightly indirect, as if he were feeling his way towards something he hadn't rehearsed. Then he said, "I've noticed you've been more contained recently." Contained. The word landed gently, but it revealed a lot. He talked about team strain, about increased friction, about how things felt harder than they used to. He didn't accuse me of causing it. He framed it as a collective challenge, one that required everyone stepping up. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, he waited. The old expectation hovered between us, the assumption that I would translate his concern into solutions, that I would reassure him, that I would quietly resume the work of smoothing what felt rough. I didn't. Instead, I asked a single question. "Are you asking me to take ownership of decisions I didn't make?" The room went still, not tense, just focused. He hesitated, then said, "No, of course not." I nodded. "Then I think what you're seeing is the system operating as designed." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cite grievances. I didn't reference past apologies or slights. I spoke slowly, evenly, as if discussing process, which in truth I was. I explained that I had been aligning my work more closely with formal accountability. I was happy to support decisions, but not to absorb responsibility for them without authority. That was when clarity existed. Things moved smoothly. When it didn't, friction was inevitable. He listened carefully. For the first time in a long while, he didn't interrupt me. I could see him recalibrating. Not defensively, but thoughtfully. This wasn't a battle. It was a boundary being named without emotion. He asked if I felt undervalued. I said, "I feel accurately positioned now." That answer seemed to surprise him more than anything else. There was no resolution in that meeting. No promise of change. No apology offered or requested. And that was fine. The confrontation wasn't about fixing the past. It was about making the present unambiguous. When I stood to leave, he thanked me again, this time without the casual tone. There was respect there. Not warmth. No approval. Respect. And respect, I had learned, doesn't require volume. It requires clarity. I walked back to my desk feeling neither triumphant nor heavy. Just settled. The line had been drawn, not aggressively, not defensively, but clearly enough that it didn't need to be revisited. The system would adjust, or it wouldn't. Either way, I would no longer disappear inside it. Who I am now isn't defined by what I endured, but by what I no longer carry. I still work in the same environment. I still attend meetings, review documents, and manage complexity. From the outside, my life looks largely unchanged. There was no dramatic exit, no visible victory, no public acknowledgement of what shifted. But internally, everything is different. I no longer mistake usefulness for worth. I no longer equate silence with professionalism. I no longer believe that absorbing discomfort is a virtue simply because it keeps things smooth for others. I understand now that systems don't reward integrity by default. They respond to boundaries. And boundaries don't require explanation once they're consistently enforced. My relationships at work have changed. Subtly, but meaningfully. People speak more carefully around me. They ask before assuming. They clarify ownership. Not because I demanded it, but because ambiguity no longer dissolves when it reaches me. Some colleagues drifted away. Others became more respectful. A few seemed unsettled by the shift, unsure how to engage without the old dynamic to lean on. That discomfort doesn't bother me. Discomfort, I've learned, is often just the sensation of reality reasserting itself. I'm calmer than I used to be. Not the kind of calm that comes from endurance, but the kind that comes from alignment. I don't rehearse conversations in my head anymore. I don't second guess whether I should have said more or less. I say what is necessary, when it is necessary, and I let the rest stand. There's no bitterness here. I don't see myself as someone who was wronged and then reclaimed power. I see myself as someone who learned to stop volunteering for erasure. That distinction matters, because it means I don't need anyone else to change for me to remain intact. I don't need validation. I don't need acknowledgement. I don't need apologies. I have clarity, and clarity is self-sustaining. When I think back to the version of myself who believed silence was the price of keeping her job, I don't feel regret. I feel compassion. She did what she knew how to do. She survived by adapting, but I don't live there anymore. Now my silence is deliberate. My voice is precise. My presence is bounded. And that, it turns out, is enough. There's a moment, usually long after the situation has passed, when you finally understand what it cost you to stay quiet. Not in dramatic ways. Not in the language of trauma or betrayal. But in smaller, more persistent forms. Hesitation, self-editing. The instinct to smooth over truths before they ever leave your mouth. For me, the cost wasn't losing a job or a reputation. I was losing clarity about where my responsibility ended and someone else's began. When my manager forced me to apologize for a problem I didn't cause, I told myself it was leadership. I told myself it was maturity. I told myself it didn't matter. What I didn't see then was that every time I absorbed accountability that wasn't mine, I was teaching the system that my integrity was flexible. And systems remember what you teach them. Silence for a long time was the price of keeping my job. I paid it because it felt safer than resistance, because it preserved stability, because it avoided conflict. But silence has different meanings depending on who controls it. When silence is imposed, it diminishes you. When silence is chosen, it protects you. That distinction is the quiet center of this story. I didn't reclaim my agency by fighting. I didn't expose anyone or demand recognition. I simply stopped compensating for decisions I didn't make. I let accountability settle where it belonged. I allowed discomfort to surface without rushing to erase it. And in doing so, I learned something that applies far beyond any single workplace. You don't need to raise your voice to change the shape of a system. You need to stop holding it together at your own expense. There is no villain in this story. There is no hero either. Just a set of patterns that continued until someone opted out of reinforcing them. That someone was me. If this story resonates, it might not be because you've experienced the same events, but because you've recognized the same role. The reliable one. The quiet one. The person who keeps things running without being seen. If that's you, I hope this offers something more useful than encouragement. I hope it offers clarity. You are not difficult to want alignment. You are not disloyal for naming boundaries. You are not unprofessional for refusing to apologize for what isn't yours. Sometimes, the most ethical thing you can do is step back and let reality speak for itself. Before you go, I want to leave you with one open question. One that doesn't demand an answer, but invites reflection. Where in your life are you still paying for peace with silence? And what might change if that silence became a choice instead? If you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.